Finding a body without obvious signs of violence may seem like a straightforward case until a tiny detail, almost unnoticed, completely changes the course of the investigation. This is a story of the day. A simple mark on an elderly man's clothing revealed something no one else had noticed, uncovering a truth no one expected. I am Dr. Julio Rivas, a forensic doctor in Quito, and today I want to share with you one of the most puzzling cases of my career. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far the story has reached. It all started on a gray afternoon when we received a call about the discovery of an elderly man at his home. A concerned neighbor, who hadn't heard from him for days, found him sitting in his living room, apparently without any wounds or external signs of violence. His calm face and relaxed posture seemed to suggest a natural death, but in forensic medicine, calm often hides unexpected realities. Upon arrival, I examined the body, and everything seemed to indicate the cause of death could be a heart attack or a common cardiovascular problem in older adults. But then, something caught my attention, a small, dark, and unusual stain on the cuff of his shirt, a stain that seemed insignificant but didn't fit the usual pattern. To anyone else, it might have been just a dirt mark, but to a forensic expert, it's a clue worth investigating. At that moment, I realized that stain was the key that would open the Pandora's box of this mystery. Not only did that tiny detail lead me to examine the scene more carefully, but by connecting that mark with other minimal elements, the story of a deceased began to take shape. That mark told an invisible tale to untrained eyes, the last hours of the man's life. I had to delve not only into the medical aspect, but also into daily life, relationships, and the objects around him. That mark on his clothing implied an encounter, a movement, or a gesture no one had documented or considered important in the initial reports. Sometimes we think a body tells us everything through visible wounds or obvious evidence. But in reality, the body is much more subtle. Every fold, every stain or scratch is a chapter of a story that only those who know how to read can uncover. And that was a great lesson this case taught me. To observe with patience and respect, because every detail has meaning. If you want to know how that strange stain unveiled a secret that changed the entire direction of the case, join me in this story where we will learn that in forensic medicine, nothing is accidental and everything has a reason. From Google to the streets of Quito, the truth can be hidden in the smallest things. This case reminded me that a forensic expert is not only a specialist in bodies, but also a storyteller who must listen to what silence wants to reveal. There is much left to discover. So don't go away and stay with me as we decipher that mark and the mystery that came with it. When I arrived at the scene, everything seemed to point to a peaceful, almost natural death. An elderly gentleman, sitting in his rocking chair, as if he wanted to rest one last time in his favorite spot in the house. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, no disturbances. Simply, his serene expression and the quiet atmosphere of a home that had witnessed so many years. But it was then when I decided to take a closer look at his clothing that I noticed something that at first glance might have seemed insignificant. A small mark on the pocket of his shirt. It was a faint stain, barely visible, a reddish shadow mixed with subtle lines of what appeared to be a different substance. At first, I thought it could be a simple spill or a paint stain, but something about that mark told me I needed to look more closely. The stain had a particular shape, like a poorly drawn symbol or a pressure pattern. And it did not seem accidental. It wasn't located where one would expect to find a common stain, right on the side of the pocket, as if something had pressed or scraped the fabric intentionally. The curious thing was that, when I compared this finding with the rest of the scene, things began to fit together differently. I started wondering, how did that mark get there and what exactly had it revealed? While my colleagues limited themselves to recording the scene as it appeared, I felt the urgency to investigate further, because to me, a person's clothing can be as revealing as any other physical evidence. I reviewed the security footage in the house again, although there were no visible cameras that could give me clues at first. I tried talking to the neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything unusual or if the gentleman had had any recent arguments or disputes, but everyone agreed he was a quiet, well-liked man who rarely received visitors. Some mentioned that the day before they had heard someone calling him on the phone several times. That led me to check his cell phone, finding records and messages that pointed to recent conversations with someone identified only as M. Curiosity led me to delve deeper into those interactions, and I noticed that the last call had ended abruptly, minutes before the body was found. Meanwhile, in the lab, we analyzed the substance in the stain. It turned out to be a type of indelible ink, a special kind that does not erase easily and is used to mark documents or valuable items. This suggested that the stain was not an accident, but a kind of clear mark, something someone wanted to leave or that remained when they tried to hide something on his clothing. But what could have made that mark so important? I began to consider that perhaps this mark had a hidden story, not only in the clothing, but also in the relationship the gentleman had maintained with that mysterious person from the calls. Every small detail began to make sense. The stain on the fabric did not seem to match a physical fight, but rather someone handling something, perhaps a document or an envelope, and leaving it carelessly in view. It was then that I went back to examine the house, this time with a magnifying glass. I found a drawer with an envelope stained with the same ink, containing some papers inside. Upon opening it carefully, I discovered a set of letters and receipts related to disputed properties, an issue that seemed to have weighed heavily on the man's recent life. In those letters, the ink of the marks matched that of the stain on his shirt, indirectly revealing a veiled threat and a silent legal battle that no one in the community had reported. As the investigation deepened, a character appeared whom I had not considered until then, a distant relative who had been trying unsuccessfully to claim part of that property. This individual, known only in official documents, seemed to have had enough motive to cause fear and intense stress in the elderly man. This began to form a much more complex picture than what seemed to be a simple natural death. Not only because of the evidence itself, but because of what that mark on the clothing was telling me, that small, almost invisible trace that forced me to look behind the scene when everyone else considered the case closed. What impressed me was how such a small detail could shake the entire narrative. From an apparently peaceful man, we moved to a story filled with tension and secrets, where every element seemed to hide more questions than answers. I realized that death is not always what it seems, and that in my work, patience and attention to detail can be the difference between closing a case and opening a door to the hidden truth. Little by little, the pieces began to fit. The ink marks on the clothing matched similar marks on the documents and the envelope I found. It seemed that someone had forced a relationship to obtain financial gain. There were no obvious signs of direct physical violence, which indicated that if there had been pressure or coercion, it had been more psychological or indirect, something that would leave marks difficult to detect in a first examination. However, that mark on the clothing was more than a clue. It was a silent statement of what had occurred moments before death. The toxicology results indicated the presence of a compound that could have accelerated the deterioration state, but left no visible marks, and that explained the apparent tranquility at the initial scene. That combination of stress generated by personal conflicts and that strange compound made me suspect that not everything had been as spontaneous as it seemed, and that perhaps there was an intention, a hidden mechanism to hasten the inevitable. At that moment, I remembered something a colleague told me years ago. In forensic medicine, what you don't see at first glance is often what matters most. And that phrase never made so much sense as in this case. I observed the house once again, paying attention not only to the obvious facts, but also to the omissions, absences, and to that silence filled with untold stories. In the end, I knew that mark, small as it was, had not only changed the course of the investigation, but had rewritten the story of that death, giving us a window into a world of family secrets, silent pain, and justice pursued in the shadows. And as I gathered all that information, I understood that beyond the lifeless body, every case is a story that deserves to be heard with respect and care, because behind every mark, no matter how minimal, there is a truth waiting to be discovered. What came after that discovery was a whirlwind of contradictions and uncomfortable silences. The initial scene, simple and seemingly harmless, began to unravel like an old fabric, revealing hidden layers beneath the surface. That small stain, that faint mark, had opened the door to a world no one wanted to explore, but was impossible to ignore. I then decided to take a step further and request a more detailed review of the M calls. I was not only interested in knowing who that person was, but also what pattern their conversations followed and the tone of their relationship in the moments leading up to the incident. To my surprise, the recordings, which initially seemed like a daily routine, showed signs of increasing tension. On several occasions, the elderly man's voice trembled, almost as if trying to calm someone or perhaps himself. On the other hand, the interlocutor's voice sounded authoritative, even threatening at times. The more I listened, the more I realized we were dealing with pressure that went far beyond a simple property dispute. There was fear, urgency, a kind of unspoken ultimatum felt in every word. That information fit with a note shouted into the fabric of the shirt, as if the ink had a life of its own and wanted to tell that story. Why indelible ink? What did that substance have that someone considered important enough to leave it as evidence? I couldn't get out of my head the idea that perhaps that poorly drawn symbol, that carefully positioned stain, was not just an accident. It was a message, a warning, or worse, a sign of coercion. As the investigation progressed, I began interviewing people closer to the man, neighbors, distant family, and even some acquaintances from years past. Among them was a key figure, a distant nephew, a man with complicated financial history, and a record of disputes over inheritances. According to statements, he had been trying to contact the man for months without success, and recently a new legal claim had arisen that was not public knowledge. This detail was significant because it shed light on the possibility of a confrontation that was not only economic, but perhaps personal, charged with resentments and reproaches held for years. It became clear that the stress caused by this dispute had affected the man's health, although that alone does not explain such a sudden and seemingly peaceful death. That was when I returned to the toxicology results. The substance detected was rare, an uncommon derivative used in experimental medicine, with subtle yet severe effects on the nervous and cardiovascular systems, capable of accelerating organ failure without leaving visible injuries. This was a piece of the puzzle that revealed a disturbing truth. Someone had manipulated the man's health using covert methods, making it appear as a natural death. When I realized this, I understood that we were facing a case where the violence was invisible at first glance, invisible to simple observation, a crime that had more to do with the mind and patience, with progressive wear, with veiled threats, with power games and silences broken by that indelible ink which I now saw as a contained scream. I wanted to delve into that psychological character that the evidence was describing so subtly. During a further review at the house, I stood for a long time in front of the desk with a marked envelope and the letters lay piled up. I could imagine the moments before the scene, the elderly man reviewing documents, worried, perhaps unknowingly spilling that ink, perhaps marking without knowing that this trace would become the key. I could almost feel the weight of the years of unresolved conflicts, the growing pressure that slowly consumed him, a silent battle no one else seemed to notice. The detail that finally made me shudder was a small, desperate attempt in one of the letters, a postscript written with the same ink, where the man asked for a truce, proposing a meeting to resolve the conflict before it was too late. That was a whole confession of fear and exhaustion, a silent cry from a man who knew the risk was not only in papers and legal disputes, but in his own safety and health. Looking at that letter, I realized that mark on his clothing was not a mistake, not an accident. It was a mute testimony of everything his body and life had endured in those last hours and days. A testimony that no shout or visible sign could match, but that for me as a forensic specialist was more eloquent than any confession. What followed, beyond the ink on the fabric or the shadows in the calls, was to discover who or would turn that fear and dispute into an act with irreversible consequences for that man. And in the search for the truth, names, broken promises, and family disputes became fundamental pieces that I began to connect one by one. Because that subtlest symptom, that mark on the shirt, had shown me that the quietest stories can sometimes be the loudest. The danger of my work lies in the frequent belief that death is a closed final point. But I learned that day and since then that many times it is only a comma, where small marks, unspoken words, and minimal details cause to look again, to dig beneath the visible, to interpret a language forgotten by others. That idea left me standing in front of the house, wondering how many times the truth was right there, within reach, but no one stopped long enough to see it. And when I looked again at that stain, I understood that in it there was more than ink, there was life. A life saturated with frustrations, fears, and a profound desire to be remembered and protected, even in the shadow of death. Something inside me knew the story was just beginning, and that beyond that indelible memory and the tranquil scene, much remained to be discovered. Because marks, especially the smallest ones, never lie. And that case, without a doubt, had taught me that a forensic specialist's job does not end when we find the body. It truly begins when we understand the story the body wants to tell. Returning to that house again and again was like entering an invisible labyrinth, where every corner, every small detail, seemed to hold a secret for me. It was clear that the very air retained a tension that did not disappear with the departure of the body, an impossible mixture of memories, guilt, and silences so dense they seemed almost tangible. Sitting in front of the desk, surrounded by disorganized papers and scattered memories, gave me a strange feeling, as if that very room whispered the truth I needed to reach, but resisted handing it over easily. What impacted me most was how that man, with his history full of defeats and silent battles, had tried to speak to me through that simple ink mark on his shirt. That stain, apparently insignificant, was the last visible manifestation of his anguish. And I had to realize something fundamental. Forensic medicine was not only about bodies. It was about listening to those voices that otherwise would be lost forever. One of those investigation days, I received an unexpected call. It was someone I had not considered until then, a person who apparently had little to do with the family or the legal matters, but who might have a different perspective on the man. She was a close friend, a domestic worker who had worked for him for years. Her account was as moving as it was revealing. She spoke of endless nights in which the elderly gentleman stayed awake, restless and worried, looking at the phone with hope and fear. She said she had perceived a mixture of fear and determination in him, as if he were trapped in a race against an invisible enemy. She also mentioned that month before his death, there had been a strange incident. Someone had tried to force a lock on the house, but it was not reported because he did not want to make noise. This small piece of information set off an alarm in me. The danger was real, close, and more personal than anyone imagined. As my mind spun trying to organize those facts, I felt a complex web weaving around the seemingly peaceful death, that sensation of constant threat, which was not visible at first glance but was there, latent in every pleading word of that letter, in every call charged with tension, in that indelible stain that seemed to demand justice. Then I remembered I had to go back once more to the forensic lab. The substance detected in the analyses, that experimental toxin no one had heard of before, deserved every possible scrutiny. With the collaboration of a small team of experts in advanced toxicology, we worked hard to study that substance in detail. What we discovered was truly unsettling. It was not just a compound capable of causing silent damage, but its use was connected to very limited reports on cases where attempts were made to manipulate patients with terminal illnesses or cognitive disabilities to inevitably accelerate their deterioration. It was a cold and calculated act, wrapped in legalities and appearances of medical care, but essentially an act of violent negligence or direct intent to cause harm. This conclusion opened a new angle in the investigation. The motive was not simply fear or family dispute, but perhaps the intention to make him disappear without leaving visible traces of violence, a crime designed to go unnoticed by time and institutions. But the most disturbing came when we deepened into the dynamics between the man and his distant nephew, the only family member who had frequent access to his house in the weeks before his death. The testimonies that initially seemed tempered, with a tone of conditional respect, began to show cracks. We discovered that this nephew had acquired some controversial medications irregularly in the city, and that he had been present in heated and occasionally aggressive discussions with the elderly man. More surprising was the revelation that, a few days before the death, there had been an unexpected nighttime visit coinciding with the probable moment the toxic substance had been administered. All this information reminded me of one of the first lessons I learned in forensic medicine. The body may be silent, but it never lies. Science can reveal what appearance hides. Those clues, because there are never coincidences in a case like this, began to build a structure of truth and pain that demanded justice. It was inevitable that the investigation escalated into dark zones, where names and faces mixed with conflicted feelings. Some people closed on themselves, denied evidence, or simply disappeared into shadows, while others showed heartbreaking fragility, victims of the same family storm that ended the elderly man's life. And I found myself in the middle, Try and keep calm and maintain scientific rigor amid a sea of emotions that at times threatened to overwhelm me. Each new piece of data seemed to add another link to a chain of events that, far from clarifying everything, deepened the feeling that more secrets were kept, more shadows deserved to be illuminated. There, in that darkness, I understood that the death of that man was not just an isolated event, but the result of a complex human conflict, full of ambitions, fears, and decisions made in the dark out of common sight and consciousness. I remember specific moments, sitting in that house so full of history, looking through the window that faced the backyard, wondering how a man at his age, with so much life left and the courage to write that desperate letter, could lose that silent battle, a battle that, far from ending with his death, seemed to begin a new chapter of struggle, this time for those of us left seeking justice and explanations. That night, while reviewing the files once again, a thought struck me strongly. Each of U.S. leaves marks that, although invisible to common eye, can be read by those willing to look closely. In that particular ink stroke absorbed into the fabric, in that contained vibration of his voice and the recordings, in the hidden chemistry of his blood, was a complete story that needed to be told to do justice. And so, as the hours passed and day turned to night, I felt that this case, more than just another file in my career, was becoming a profound lesson about human nature and forensic medicine. Not just about techniques and analyses, but about patience, empathy, and the value of not letting go of even the smallest detail. I learned that behind every case there are lives crying to be remembered with dignity, that there is no death without a story nor death without testimony, and that sometimes those testimonies hide behind an apparently trivial stain or an uncomfortable silence. For me, that elderly man would not simply become a name and a body in a report. He would become the voice that, through indelible ink, forced me to see the truth and keep searching, always with respect and with the certainty that justice, although sometimes delayed, can be born from patience and observation. The work of forensic expert is often this: opening invisible doors, interpreting hidden messages between the lines, and surviving the helplessness of witnessing one death to prevent another. That is why, every time I close a case, I carry with me those little stories that remind me why I do what I do, and why, even when it seems all is lost, I never stop looking for an answer, a mark, or a sign that gives meaning to that ending. Because death, I learned, is not always an end. It is a warning, a legacy, and sometimes a challenge that demands our attention and humanity. As I delved deeper into each piece of information, I felt how the tangle became denser, and what initially seemed evident now turned inexplicable. There were details that, although small, carried immense weight within that man's story. The stain on his shirt was not just material clue, but concrete proof of a silent process, a struggle fought without many noticing. Understanding how that experimental substance had reached his hands, who administered it, and why, became my daily obsession. Visits to the laboratory were long, almost ritualistic. The toxicology specialist moved slowly through protocols and tests, aware that everything could change if we found even a single new clue. It was on one of those days when a tissue sample extracted from the body revealed something controversial. Tiny traces of a compound derived from a chemical used in water filters and industrial purification, something completely out of context for a human organism. The presence of this substance not only pointed to calculated poisoning, but also to a method designed to blend into the everyday. That meant we faced an adversary with enough knowledge and resources to manipulate the scene so that the damage went unnoticed. That was when I decided to focus the investigation on that forced lock months earlier. It was likely that the illegal attempt to enter the house was not a random act, but the initial manifestation of a more complex threat. The carefully copied fingerprints, the discreet but determined cuts in the wood, all indicated that someone not only wanted to enter, but had conducted some sort of prior surveillance, a study of the territory aimed at breaching that man's security. I couldn't stop imagining the anguish he must have felt, knowing that someone was lurking, invisible but nearby, stalking a vulnerable victim. That perspective presented a new angle from which to view the case. It was not just a death. It was a silent stalking that culminated in tragedy. When I went back to review the recordings, I came across the phone calls a housekeeper had mentioned to me, but this time I analyzed them with almost obsessive patience. In the tone of his voice, in the pause before responding, in the hurried rhythm when dialing the number, there was palpable anxiety, fear that someone might listen or interrupt. Something was hidden behind those broken words, and every time he repeated a phrase, I sensed an underlying coded message. Suddenly, one call in particular caught my attention. It was brief, full of jolts, with an abrupt click that cut the conversation. According to the phone's metadata, it was made just a few hours before the death. That meant that just before closing his eyes forever, his mind was trapped in that disturbing communication. The question that arose was inevitable. What was he trying to seek or afraid to communicate in those last moments? The relationship with his nephew began to gain more weight in the investigation. It was not unusual that in a distant, detached family circle, certain secrets were kept under the shadow of superficial respect. But tensions danced beneath the surface, and that house, so silent, was the setting for a drama many did not want to face. Information about the nephew, his access to unauthorized medications, disputes recorded by anonymous witnesses, and even whispered rumors about possible debts and old conflicts made us see the young man with new eyes. He did not appear as an obvious villain, but as someone trapped in a dark game, where blood ties and power intertwined in hard-to-separate ways. Was he guilty? Just a pawn in a bigger plan? The truth needed to come out, but the web was tangled in lies and half-truths. The unexpected nighttime visits became another key link. From the testimonies, we managed to reconstruct at least one night. It was a stealthy arrival, with measured steps and no disturbance. Someone who knew the house routine well. That visit coincided with the probable administration of the toxin, and the connection no longer seemed coincidental. The fact that the man had locked himself in a room of a mix of fear and resignation only reinforced the hypothesis of a meticulous attack. It could have been a quick confrontation, a silent imposition, or a voluntary submission under coercion. However, the end was the same. The victim was at the mercy of an invisible enemy who manipulated death from the shadows. As the inquiries progressed, doubts multiplied, and the weight of responsibility grew in my chest. I tried to stay objective, but I could not help feeling deep empathy for that man who increasingly revealed himself as a human being trapped in a storm he did not deserve. His family, far from showing unity or clear compassion, was divided into factions that had more than they revealed. The housekeeper, that silent and important figure, became a key witness whose memories shed light, but also showed the cracks of a system where silence sometimes kills as much as violence. One day, while reviewing the documents once again, a thought struck me forcefully. How many lives like this had not found justice simply because they lacked that meticulous gaze? I realized that forensic medicine, in its essence, not only uncovers deaths, but rescues those who could not defend themselves. Every piece of evidence represents a voice, a story that deserves to be heard, and that can change perceptions, expose hidden truths, and most importantly, open a path to justice. The emotional burden was intense, but it was also what gave meaning to every hour spent on that case. The tension grew, but I also sensed an unfolding network of unexpected allies, chemical analysis experts, the police who patiently followed seemingly minor leads, and people who, from their pain, trusted that this story deserved to be told in full. A domino effect was underway. What began as an apparently simple case was turning into a mirror reflecting many other hidden realities, in which negligence, abandonment, and injustice combined to silence the most vulnerable. The stain on the clothes, the authorship of the toxin, the family silences, and the tensions experienced compose a complex story that, despite everything, could be reconstructed and understood. Among so many twists, one of the most distressing moments was when I received an anonymous letter written in trembling but precise handwriting, where someone warned me to proceed with caution, that not everything seemingly was within the reach of justice, and that some powerful people prefer to keep the truth buried. It was not a trivial threat, but a call to attention. I felt we were touching sensitive chords, and that feeling drove me with greater determination. The commitment was twofold. Not only give voice to the man who could no longer defend himself, but also protect those who, in some way, fought alongside me against a system that sometimes holds more secrets than necessary. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to show concrete results. I was able to connect the irregular purchase of the prohibited medications to a supplier known for infiltrating illegal substances into the local medical market. That led to a small network of complicity extending beyond the family circle, involving people who profited from others' vulnerability and designed plans to eliminate obstacles without leaving visible traces. Advanced toxicology had discovered that the specific chemical used in the poisoning was a modified derivative designed to act slowly, causing progressive and silent decline, which explained the apparent naturalness of the man's deterioration to conventional doctors. By that point, the investigation ceased to be just a forensic analysis and became a story of resistance. For the first time, I felt the magnitude of my role not only as a scientist, but also as a defender of human memory. It was not just about evidence and procedures, but about justice and reparation. Every statement, every laboratory, every attempt to reconstruct the story was carried out with the certainty that I was granting post-mortem dignity that otherwise would be lost among the rubble of silence. But although clarity began to appear, darkness also manifested in unexpected ways. Someone tried to interfere with the laboratory tests, manipulating results and generating doubts among some team members. It was a desperate attempt to stop the truth, a reminder that the path to uncovering it is not always simple or linear. However, that warning only strengthened our commitment. We could not allow intimidation or threats to silence the voices we had uncovered, not after all we had come to understand. As I gathered and cross-checked every piece of information, I remembered that man's words in his letter, the urgent need to be heard, the hope placed in someone who looked beyond the corpse, who understood his fears and dared to speak the truth. That stain on the shirt was not just a chemical evidence of a silent murder. It was a symbol, a heartbeat that, even in death, cried out for justice. His story had reached me, and I knew I could not fail him. I found myself then at a crucial point, where the tension did not subside, and every advance opened new questions, new paths to explore. What seemed like a simple file had become a deep, painful, and necessary human story. Because, in the end, every life has layers, every death leaves a legacy, and for those of us at the forefront of these investigations, there are never simple cases. There are only truths waiting to be uncovered and voices needing to be heard, even if that means venturing into the shadows and confronting the complexity of what it means to be human. The night was dense, and despite the clock striking untimely hours, the house remained lit by the faint light escaping through the windows. I clearly remember that moment when, by chance or perhaps by fate, I found myself reviewing security footage again, this time hoping to find a detail that had gone unnoticed the first time. And indeed, I found it. Amid a sequence of almost monotonous images, a barely perceptible reflection on the screen sent me a message. Someone passed by carrying a small box wrapped in plastic, moving quickly but carefully, as if aware they were being watched. The camera didn't capture it well, but the posture, speed, and direction confirmed what I already suspected. The stealthy visit was not a mere act of curiosity or theft, but something much more premeditated and dangerously calculated. That box was a missing key in the puzzle, an object that could contain the substance or traces of a illegal chemical. I soon went to police to request a specific search of the house, and while the team acted, I couldn't help but feel that I was venturing deeper and deeper into a territory where all certainties dissolved. That night, the investigation took on an almost frantic pace, but nothing surpassed the revelation that came with the discovery. Inside a small hidden compartment in the room, under the wooden floor, they found a vial with remnants of a murky liquid, accompanied by forged labels and altered medical records. It was not just proof of use. It was the heart of the web of deception I had gradually been unraveling. Seeing that vial affected me more than I expected. It seemed so insignificant, yet it held the poison that had silently infiltrated the man's life. I remember feeling a chill, as if the silence of that house had turned into a contained scream. I couldn't help but think of the person who had delivered or administered that poison. Someone who knew that if they didn't act stealthily, the plan would collapse. And then I remembered the nephew. He was not just a troublesome relative, but an actor with access, knowledge, and a motive strong enough to orchestrate such a sophisticated plot. Testimonies placed him at least at one of the critical moments, although he firmly denied any direct involvement. However, finding the vial was like having a piece on the board that he couldn't explain away with convincing excuses. Tension was palpable in every interrogation, in every clash of words among the family, who now seemed divided into small factions, some seeking to protect, others trying to expose. The appearance of unity was only a mask beginning to crack. As the investigation progressed, disturbing details emerged. Unusual bank transactions, secret meetings in the city, even contacts with individuals operating on the margins of the system, exploiting the vulnerabilities of those least able to defend themselves. It was a dark world where crime disguised itself as routine and power was used to silence. But what struck me the most was a story that came from the mouth of the housekeeper, who had until then remained in the background. That modest woman, with her measured voice full of silences, began to share pieces of the puzzle with a courage I had not expected. She recounted how, in the weeks before the man's death, she noticed subtle changes. Sudden forgetfulness, stomach discomfort he tried to hide, and that growing shadow of fear, the feeling that someone was watching him and he could do nothing to face it. Once, almost accidentally, she overheard him speaking on the phone with a trembling voice, as if begging to be left alone, wishing only to live his last days without disturbances. Those words, laden with resignation and pain, humanized the entire case even more. We were no longer only talking about evidence and proof, but about a human being who, despite his circumstances, had endured a silent struggle with dignity. It was alongside these revelations that I received another note, this time much more direct, sent by hand, with no sender and written in rushed handwriting. It warned me not to trust anyone outside my close circle and suggested that certain family members could be involved not only in the death but in manipulations far beyond it. Suspicion and paranoia mingled with the pressure I was already feeling. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to an abyss from which I might not emerge unscathed. But that fear wasn't enough to stop me. I knew true justice was within reach, but only if I kept my gaze steady and remembered why I was there. The following weeks were a delicate balancing act. The laboratory progressed with increasingly specific analyses. The police began filing preliminary charges, and the media started showing discreet interest, although the pieces of the case still held secrets. It was then that an unexpected twist changed the entire course. Genetic evidence showed that the nephew had accessed the same chemical substance before the poisoning, and his phone displayed coded communications with people linked to the illegal distribution network. That seemed like a definitive blow, but also sparked a deep and personal ethical debate. To what extent were we facing an organized conspiracy, or simply a man lost in the murky environment of fractured family relations and hidden dealings? Reality had never appeared so complex, and the truth seemed buried beneath multiple layers of interests and ancestral fears. While all this was happening, I couldn't help but think of the man I had known only as a body, a file. Now, every time I closed my eyes, I saw his figure sitting in that room, with his stained shirt, fighting an invisible enemy pulling the strings in the shadows. I thought about his fear, his loneliness, and how little the world had been willing to listen. This case was, beyond science, a powerful reminder that behind every body is a person with stories, with pains, with invisible struggles. And as a forensic expert, my duty was not only to discover the cause of death, but to tell his full story, to give voice and dignity, even if that meant challenging structures and facing darkness head-on. One of the hardest moments came when the judge allowed some contact between the nephew and the family in an attempt to seek reconciliation. It was a delicate act, a fragile truce that revealed the complexity of human relationships amid grief. However, it was also a point where all masks began to fall and repressed emotions surfaced with overwhelming force. Testimonies that once seemed irrelevant gained meaning, and new confessions emerged, showing that even the closest family can harbor secrets that, if kept hidden, can kill slowly. Between tears and confrontations, a wounded, fragmented yet genuine human mosaic appeared. That dynamic added a human dimension to the investigation, which until then had been based on facts and technical evidence. The case then became a kind of mirror where we saw not only the death of an individual, but the invisible cracks in society, neglect of the elderly, drug trafficking, institutional negligence, and fragility of family ties in the face of materialism and distrust. That revelation was perhaps the most painful. It wasn't only about safeguarding scientific truth, but also understanding the social context that allowed that lethal poison to infiltrate. These were moments of introspection and learning when I, with over 2 decades in forensic medicine, understood that a case can be both a lesson and a warning. The fight for justice to prevail was not easy. Amid legal processes full of delays, bureaucratic entanglements, and political pressures, Some key players try to divert attention or downplay the case. However, close collaboration among forensic experts, dedicated police officers, and people who, despite their vulnerability, wanted to break the silence proved vital to keep the pursuit alive. In that combative effort, it became clear that forensics was not a solitary path. It was a team effort where patience, dedication, and humanity converged to confront the shadows that try to hide the truth. One night, reviewing notes and findings again, I felt an intense mix of exhaustion and determination. The stain on the shirt, that small detail that seemed so insignificant, had become a man's voice, the symbol of a silent and deadly struggle. It was then that I understood I could not stop. I had to keep exploring every thread of the story as far as justice would allow. Because that stain not only spoke of a crime, but of a broken system, and the urgent need for repair. Each advance revealed another chapter of that story, and I remained there, determined not to let it be lost to oblivion. Today, as I tell you this, I feel this case changed how I see my profession. It taught me that forensic work is much more than technical determinations. It is listening to voices society often ignores. It is healing invisible wounds. It is an act of justice that transcends science and reaches the human heart. And though the path is tortuous and sometimes seems endless, each finding, each certainty built with patience, opens a window to the truth that not only clarifies a death, but challenges everyone to look beyond the obvious, to never forget that behind every body is a story waiting to be told. And those stories, no matter how small or heartbreaking, are not meant to be lost in the noise of the world. That night, while I was reviewing the documents and everything we had discovered so far, a strange feeling came over me, a mixture of exhaustion and an unease difficult to explain. I knew we were dealing with something deeper than it seemed at first glance. Every detail, no matter how small, was like a thread in that dark fabric that had been woven around the life of that man and that had ultimately led to his death. The stain on the shirt was not just a stain. It was a gateway to a labyrinth of secrets, deliberate actions, shadows that moved faster than our intuition could grasp. The next day, I returned to the scene, this time determined to observe every corner of that house with almost obsessive patience. The temperature, the objects, the textures, the arrangement of the furniture. Everything seemed to tell a story, even if it couldn't be perceived at first sight. I found curious details. A slightly moved chair, marks on the floor that had been overlooked, a drawer left ajar containing crumpled documents and photographs that seemed to hold more meaning than they showed at first glance. It was there in that small space where I found a set of wrinkled letters and handwritten notes barely able to hold a hope or fear of the deceased man. Words spoke of veiled threats, encounters that had become uncomfortable, pressures that made him feel trapped as if each day were a countdown to an inevitable end. One of the letters was especially disturbing. The ink had run, almost illegible due to moisture, but I managed to decipher words like protection, last chance, and broken trust. Who wrote that, and to whom was it addressed? Was it a plea, a warning, or a confession? From there, the tension grew. I began to understand that this man had not only been the victim of a criminal act, but of a system designed to crush him from multiple fronts. A web of secrets, lies, and manipulations in which people who seemed close were capable of playing with someone's life without remorse. The family, that unit which in theory should be a refuge and support, had become a minefield of distrust and betrayal. What surprised me the most was the connection I was able to establish between those letters and some financial movements the police had detected. Inexplicable transactions, small but constant, radiating from accounts linked to the nephew to unknown individuals, likely intermediaries in the network trafficking prohibited substances. I discovered that those messages were not isolated fragments, but links in a chain of manipulation that had the older man as an indispensable yet expendable piece. It was then I realized that the box I saw in the recordings not only contained the vial of the lethal substance, but was also the symbol of a ruthless mechanism of control and domination. The investigation began to feel like a constant pulse between certainty and uncertainty, between what was visible and hidden, while the police continued gathering evidence and the laboratories analyzed every milliliter of the collected samples. I found myself trapped in the human dimension of the case. The housekeeper, astonishing everyone with her courage, revealed to me how she had been an indirect witness to clandestine conversations involving not only the nephew, but also people in positions usually considered untouchable. People who seemed to be part of a much larger and more dangerous game, a board where what was at stake was impunity disguised as social control. Between quiet talks and meaningful silences, she also told me how she perceived her employer in recent weeks. A man who had been slowly fading away, no longer the same. A being who, despite the pain and uncertainty, kept trying to maintain a dignity invisible to many. That human perception struck me deeply. We were not dealing with mere data or bodies. We were dealing with a memory of a life many wanted to bury with lies and omissions. The helplessness was palpable, but so was a commitment of those who decided to break the silence, because they understood that the price of silence is often higher than that of truth. However, the story was not over. As the days passed, new twists appeared, as if we were uncovering more and more layers of an apparently endless mystery. The judge, in a move that surprised everyone, authorized a meeting between the nephew and some family members. It was a risky move, seen by some as an opportunity to rebuild bridges, and by others as a risk to the investigation. What happened during that meeting was revealing. The words that had previously circulated only in whispers became evident. Secrets that refused to come out, half-confessions. Reproaches trapped in resentment that now exploded with force, unleashing an emotional storm that shook everyone present. Amid that emotional chaos, testimonies emerged that helped to further understand the web surrounding the man's death. Revelations about secret agreements, veiled threats, and maneuvers to manipulate evidence. The investigation grew in complexity and depth, but also gained humanity. For the first time, I felt the voice of the deceased resonating in that crucible of emotions. His story was being told not only through analyses and expert reports, but through the broken soul of a torn family. And it was not just a family. It was a reflection of reality that in Ecuador and in many parts of the world is experienced in silence, abandonment, vulnerability, and contempt toward the weakest. The fight for justice in this case also became a symbolic battle against those social cracks that allow corruption and negligence to flourish. The illegal trafficking of medications, the lack of institutional protection, the exploitation of fear and misinformation became invisible but powerful protagonists in this tragedy. As the judicial process continued, I witnessed how the pieces kept moving and cracking. The pressures, attempts to discredit, and uncomfortable silences became constant, but so did the resistance of those seeking truth and justice. In prolonged meetings, working groups, and interviews, collaboration between sectors made it possible for technical evidence to be accompanied by a solid narrative, a context that allowed understanding not only the what, but the why behind the death. That combination was what finally opened a window to justice. It was proven that the cause of death was neither an accident nor a coincidence, but a deliberate, coldly calculated act. The network of complicity was laid bare, along with the urgent need for change. To change not only the laws, but also how we understand and protect those most vulnerable in our society. Looking back, I still remember the way of that stain on the shirt, that small mark that seemed so insignificant but revealed the hidden truth. At that moment, I understood something fundamental. The true work of forensic expert is not just to find a cause of death in a laboratory or among papers. It is to interpret signs, connect facts, listen to silences, and above all, to restore to each person the dignity of having a complete story. Because those stories are more than accounts. They are calls of conscience, empathy, and commitment. Even today, that case accompanies me as a persistent reminder. It reminds me that sometimes the smallest details scream the loudest, that behind the death there is an entire universe of life, struggle, and resistance. And that struggle cannot end with a ruling, but must continue while there is memory, justice, and the will to confront the shadows that want to remain hidden. I will finish by saying that this case, beyond its tragedy and complexity, left me with an invaluable lesson. The search for truth is an arduous path, full of obstacles and contradictions, but it is also an opportunity to discover the value of humanity in its purest state. That is why, even though the noise of the world sometimes tries to silence those voices, I remain convinced that every mark, every stain, every broken silence is a light that must not be extinguished. And as long as that light stays on, then we have hope that as we delve deeper into the investigation, each new piece of information seemed to open more doors for us into a maze with no exit, where the truth slipped away amid the shadows of silence and fear. In the following weeks, forensic results revealed evidence confirming the presence of substances that should not have been in the man's body. But what truly surprised me was how those findings fit almost like puzzle pieces with the clues we had found at the scene and the discreet yet revealing testimonies. I then remembered the stain on the T-shirt, that subtle mark, which at first seemed like a simple anomaly, but which I now understood as the first sign of a coded message. That mark, which initially caught my attention because it did not seem accidental, was composed of a trace invisible to the naked eye, one that only meticulous observation and thorough analysis could unravel. It was then that thermal images and chemical analysis began to show us a worrying pattern. The stain contained remnants of a fibrous substance, a kind of powder with a chemical composition that should not have been accessible to the deceased, but was in the hands of those who wanted to make sure they controlled his movements until the very last moment. Every step we took brought us closer to an underground world where the boundaries between threat and protection blurred. The letters, the suspicious transactions, and the testimonies wove together into a network that revealed a toxic and ruthless relationship surrounding the elderly man. It was not just economic interests. These were manipulation strategies to silence him and prevent him from exposing uncomfortable secrets that could topple walls built with decades of complicity and corruption. It was clear we were facing a complex web of cross-influences, where the elderly man's vulnerability had become an asset for various actors, each with their own agenda and methods to maintain control. One of the most striking moments was when, thanks to a thorough review of security footage around his home, we detected unusual movements in the hours before his death. A figure appeared and disappeared multiple times in front of the door, but what caught my attention was not only the frequency, but the way this person handled certain boxes and packages, some of which were destined for the house. That figure, on further investigation, turned out to be connected to a logistics company that appeared in financial transactions detected in accounts linked to the nephew. The complicity was solidified among those who, apparently, had the capacity to deliver help or threats with the same cold indifference. During that time, we also began to re-examine the family environment, where new cracks appeared beneath the surface of supposed unity. The family gathering authorized by the judge was not only a moment of emotional explosion, but also a space where masks slowly started to fall. Leaked comments, evasive glances, and silences that meant more than words all formed a chorus of long-buried tensions under years of unspoken resentments. It was then that a distant cousin, until that moment reserved, dared to share an anecdote that seemed to pull the right thread. He recounted that months earlier the deceased had tried to contact him to tell him something serious that was happening, but felt fear and disillusionment because no one seemed willing to listen or get involved. That story, as small as it seemed, gave us a fundamental clue. The man had spent his last days in forced isolation, not only physically but emotionally, a state in which despair and threat combined to push him towards silence, perhaps even toward death itself. Understanding that human dimension was a turning point for me. As a forensic doctor, we received bodies and data, but in this case, before me was a story of social and psychological strangulation woven with invisible threads that could only be perceived with empathy and patience. I then remembered why I chose this profession. So that every body would have a voice, so that every detail lost in darkness would be collected and brought to light. That is why I committed myself to not let those signals fade into the shadows of oblivion. But the case took an unexpected turn when we received an anonymous call informing us of a hidden digital file on one of the computers found in the house, which, once unlocked, revealed electronic messages from a conversation between the deceased and an unknown contact. Those messages spoke of a broken agreement, unfulfilled promises, and veiled threats, but also an offer to protect him in exchange for his silence. That digital correspondence was tangible proof of systematic blackmail, a dangerous game where the old man's life hung by that invisible rope others pulled to manipulate him. The invisible ink of those words was revealed to the perseverance of those of us willing to look beyond the obvious detail. While the meticulous work of the team endured, external pressure intensified. Some powerful figures began exerting influence to discredit the evidence, so the investigation would not reach the bottom of things. It was then that I understood that the search for truth resided not only in science, but also in courage. Every interview I conducted, every document I examined, was an act of resistance against those who preferred to keep the veil of impunity. The housekeeper, who was no longer just a witness, became a pillar of this resistance. Her courage and honesty became windows to understand that beyond great figures, it is ordinary people who bear the burden of memory. Amid this landscape, signs of a second, darker, and transversal plot appeared, involving a network of illegal drug trafficking with direct links to local and national politics. The elderly man, because of his knowledge and experience, had discovered those connections and become an obstacle for powerful groups' interests. That revelation made the case exceed the personal and familial realm, reaching a dimension touching the institutional responsibility and ethical commitment of our society. It was not just a death story, but an urgent call to dismantle corrupt structures that allow such tragedies to happen. Statements from some protected witnesses then began to paint an increasingly clear map of that invisible network, where drugs, money, and fear operated in synergy to ensure that nothing and no one stopped them. But something unexpected also emerged. A small group of prosecutors and judges committed to justice decided to join forces and break the cycle of indifference. It was a joint effort, slow and complicated, full of legal and bureaucratic obstacles, but which gradually began yielding results in the form of arrest warrants and open proceedings against those involved. It was hope sprouting amid the bleak forensic and social landscape. In parallel, I personally dedicated myself to reconstructing the complete chronology of the death, working with experts in toxicology and scene analysis. Every detail, every stain, every fiber was reviewed with scientific obsession combined with the sensitivity of someone who knows that behind that evidence is a human being whose voice deserves to be heard. When we finally had the technical confirmation that the lethal substance had been deliberately introduced into his drink, tension reached a critical point. We had not only uncovered a covert murder, but also unmasked a system that had failed justice and humanity. The weight of that revelation was immense, yet was also a breath of fresh air for all of us who had worked tirelessly, because it meant the case would not just close with a medical report, but would become a call to action and change. As the judicial battle followed its course, the community began to mobilize. Social organizations, human rights defenders, and ordinary citizens joined forces to demand better conditions, protection for vulnerable people, and public policies to prevent such tragedies from recurring. The case, from the darkness of an analysis, had become a light highlighting the urgent need to transform realities. At the end of that stage, we faced the most difficult interview. The nephews, a man marked by contradictions, stained by suspicions, trying to justify his actions with vague arguments and evasions. The conversation was tense, at times almost unbearable, because in every word an internal struggle was felt, an act of defense, but also moments when the truth seemed to want to slip through, like a crack that could not be closed no matter how hard he tried. It was a clash between truth and self-deception, a duel that revealed not only the facts, but also the deep wounds that power and ambition can inflict on personal relationships. That day, when I closed my notebook, I was convinced that the story had transcended the individual realm to become a collective reflection about justice, dignity, and humanity. We had started with a stain, a small mark, and had come to discover a complex network that taught us that often the urgent or superficial glance prevents us from seeing the truth that beats beneath the surface. The experience taught me to cultivate patience, to listen to silence, and to respect the story of every body, every testimony, as if it were a sacred legacy. Leaving the laboratory one night, while the cold of Quito caressed my face, I understood that that stain was much more than a simple accidental mark. It was a symbol of resistance, a beacon signaling the need not to cease searching, not to give in to indifference. And that symbol, that small mark that had awakened my curiosity that first night, was now the driving force behind an entire movement that transcended my work. Because deep down I knew that as long as we remained attentive to those signals, as long as we refused to accept silence as an answer, hope will always be possible. This story, which began with the death of an elderly man, turned into an eternal lesson for me. Justice is not just about evidence or laws, but about listening to silent voices, protecting those who have no one to defend them, and remembering that behind every body, every stain, there is a life worth remembering. That is why, although the road is still long and the challenge is immense, I know this case did not end with a forensic report. It started a commitment, a constant struggle to shine light where others prefer darkness. And as long as that light shines, that stain will keep telling a story that must not be forgotten. What came next was an increasingly dark and complex web that completely absorbed us. In the midst of reconstructing that last day, the pieces seemed to fit together in ways that surpassed any initial intuition. The lethal substance had not only been administered with precision, but the chosen method spoke of a chilling premeditation. It was not a desperate or impulsive act, but a calculated maneuver to prevent someone from speaking. To think that this decision had stemmed from such an intimate and familiar place of conflict provoked in me a bitter mix of sadness and anger. Every time we reviewed the files, testimonies, or context, new characters emerged from the shadows, figures who preferred to keep their faces hidden but left undeniable traces of their involvement. Some names appeared over and over again, linked to illegal activities, money laundering, and influence peddling. The most unsettling thing was not only the scale of this network, but how it had managed to infiltrate power circles unnoticed, using sales, contracts, and seemingly legal businesses as a cover. That machinery operated with chilling precision, and the victim, that elderly man, had unwittingly touched a nerve that, for those who wanted to protect their secrets, had to be silenced at all costs. One early morning, while reviewing the video footage of the house entrance again, I discovered something that had gone unnoticed until then. A special package, clearly distinguishable by its packaging, was handed to the suspicious figure patrolling the area the night before the death. The package seemed ordinary, but when cross-referenced with chemical analyses, we found it contained something related to the substance found in the body. It was no coincidence. It was a direct link between the scene, the victim, and the perpetrators. What surprised me was how that small moment brought clarity amid the chaos, a door to concrete action within so much uncertainty. When I shared these findings with the team, I noticed a tangible change in atmosphere. The investigation ceased to be a technical procedure and became a crusade for justice. At meetings, faces tightened with concern, but also with a conviction that this case surpassed any routine protocol. At that point, the subtle stain on the man's shirt was no longer a mere forensic reference. It had become the symbol that united every fragment of truth. That mark contained the essence of the whole story, the key which, when revealed, exposed a web full of deceit and fears. But nothing prepared the team or me for the frenetic pace that ignited the final stage. A call from the lab left us stunned. A protected witness, one of those hidden actors who had remained silent out of fear or self-interest, had decided to step forward. Their testimonies were chilling, describing in detail clandestine meetings, dirty deals, and veiled threats in which names that until then we had only heard whisper were mentioned. What struck me most was the harshness of their account. It described how the deceased had become an inconvenient element for that whole system, a man who, despite his age and fragility, had the courage to confront them. It was a brutal lesson on defending dignity amid corruption and violence. With each new statement, the foundations began to shake. We recovered bank documents showing suspicious transfers linked to high-ranking politicians and businessmen with interests in strategic sectors. The drug trafficking network, that dark web thriving in the shadows, became increasingly visible. The victim, with his deep knowledge, had tried to provide information that could have dismantled that scheme, and the price had been his life. That made me think about how many people in our society are trapped in those networks, with no possibility of defense or protection. It was in this context that the pressure on us became palpable and personal. We received veiled threats, attempts to discredit our work, and unfounded challenges aimed at undermining the credibility of the entire investigation. However, reflecting on the bravery of those witnesses, the persistence of the housekeeper, and the silent echo of the stain on the shirt reaffirmed to me the need to move forward without hesitation. It was not just a case, it was a moral responsibility. Every day we dedicated to that file was a step toward honoring the memory of that man and giving a voice to those who had no choice but silence. But the biggest twist was yet to come. As we delved deeper into the electronic review of the computers, we came across a final file, hidden behind numerous layers of digital security. It was a video recorded on a mobile phone, apparently by the victim himself, in which he delivered a message that broke the silence decisively. In it, he denounced the corrupt network, mentioned specific names, and recounted how he had received direct threats to keep quiet. His words showed fear, but also a strong will for justice. That audio-visual document not only confirmed everything we had been discovering, but emotionally connected the story, showing the human and vulnerable dimension of the man behind the evidence. The presentation of that video before the judge had an immediate impact. For the first time, the deceased man's voice resonated in the courtroom, imposing and clear. The authorities began to take measures with greater determination, but we also felt how the fight moved to an even more complicated level. The media and social arena. Various actors tried to manipulate, distort information, and sought to discredit the true spokespeople. Amid that noise, the team decided to bet on transparency and open communication with the community, so they could understand that behind all those cold procedures there was a story that affected everyone in their human condition. The marches, statements, and social pressure led to the creation of special commissions to investigate the political and economic links behind the case. It was a testament to the power that a well-told story can have when it manages to connect with society. However, despite progress, each stage brought new obstacles: slow trials, bribery attempts, and smear campaigns. I understood that the search for justice is a long battle, one that does not end in the courts but also requires civic commitment and constant vigilance. During those moments, the team and I began making periodic visits to the deceased community to better understand the environment in which he had lived his last days. We discovered parallel stories of fear and silence, neighbors hiding information out of fear of reprisals. But we also found glimpses of support and solidarity, of people who slowly began to break the collective fear. It was a fragile but real process in which justice and truth began to permeate the layers of uncertainty. Before concluding this stage, I clearly remember the last meeting with the family, who, despite the cracks and recent wounds, came ready to cooperate. That meeting was tense, full of mixed emotions, but also of a deep sense of responsibility. Some family members began gestures of reconciliation and admission, while others maintained defensive positions. It was evident that the truth had stirred not only the concrete facts, but also the memories and emotions repressed for years. That day, I understood that justice is also a process of healing, albeit painful. Leaving the room and looking up again at the starry sky over Quito on that cold night brought a profound reflection. This case had carved to me a certainty. I could not afford to lose hope or humanity amid so much suffering and darkness. The stain on that man's shirt, now no longer just scientific evidence, was a constant reminder of the power of details, of the need to look beyond the obvious, and never underestimate the signs that no one seems willing to see. I know the investigation will continue, that many questions remain to be answered, and that justice can be a tortuous and slow path. But I also know that this case, which began as just another among many, became a story that imposed on us a mission to care for, protect, and honor the truth with every fiber of our professional and human being. And as long as that stain remains visible to those willing to see it, the voice of that elderly man will keep resonating, demanding justice, dignity, and respect. The story we tell does not end here. It is just beginning, and I will be there, ready never to give up. The weight of that last family meeting lingered in the air long after the doors closed. In their eyes there was as much pain as a glimpse of hope that seemed fragile, but stubbornly refused to fade. I remember that moment with the same clarity with which I speak to you now, because it was right then that I understood something essential. Beyond the documents, the evidence, and the procedures, there was a human network that every step of the investigation had unearthed unintentionally. And understanding that network, so fragile, so marked by fear and distrust, was as important as every lab result we reviewed during the endless hours of work. Going home that night was an almost mechanical act. I walked through those quiet streets of Quito, their silence interrupted only by the distant echo of some traffic or a dog barking far away. But nothing was truly calm. The words of protected witness, the details of the package, the almost imperceptible stain on the shirt that, in the end, had been the spark that ignited the fire, kept echoing in my mind. A story that started small, almost insignificant, and grew huge, complex, and even dangerous. Because we were not only talking about a crime, but about an entire network that took advantage of the shadows to extend its tentacles where no one wanted to look. What surprised me the most was the insistence with which that network had managed to disguise its operations using what seemed legitimate to many: businesses, contracts, bank transfers. I wondered, how many more times was something similar happening right under our noses, without anyone daring to question it? The answer was not encouraging, because the line between appearance and reality in these cases can be so thin that only a trained eye can distinguish the dark link hidden beneath the surface. And that is exactly the role of those of us who work as forensic specialists. To be those eyes, patient and rigorous, capable of seeing the truth in the smallest details. But not everything was clear from the beginning. There were moments when frustration threatened to overwhelm us. When the threats arrived and the attempts to discredit us became evident, I felt firsthand what it means to face structures that prefer silence and invisibility to perpetuate themselves. I even questioned whether it was all worth it, whether we could really impact such a robust and dark system. However, in those doubts, I also found a spark of strength that came from deep within. The memory of the elderly man, his courage despite his age and the weight of fear, became the engine that kept me from backing down. There were moments when, amidst reports and evidence, I stopped to think of the victim not just as a case, but as a human being full of history and dignity. That almost invisible thread on his shirt was a protagonist because it spoke without words, rescuing from silence a truth that ran the risk of being lost forever. Justice, that often so abstract concept, became humanized when you understood that behind the file was a person who fought until the last second to tell what he knew, and that is hardly measurable in numbers or sentences. As we advanced, the evidence became a password to open doors that had seemed hermetically sealed before. The video testimony recorded by the victim himself was one of those moments that shake you so deeply that the trembling but firm voice penetrated the core of the court. Seeing how that man, weakened but firm, put into words what he had discovered, and what he feared was an instant that changed the course of the case. It was impossible not to feel a mixture of sadness and admiration. Sadness for cruelty of those who decided to silence him, and admiration for his courage, for the dignified way he faces fate. After that presentation, the authorities had to act with a force that until then had seemed absent, not because they didn't want to, but because social and media pressure had grown exponentially. It was revealing to see how truth, when well supported, can move those gears that seemed stuck. But it was also evident that the path would not be quick or easy. The machinery of power does not stop easily, and its resistance manifests in multiple ways. From deliberate delays in judicial processes to media campaigns that try to sow doubt about those seeking the truth. In that scenario, I understood that our role went beyond the laboratory or the courtroom. It was necessary to open ourselves to society, connect with the community, and explain clearly without technical jargon what we found. Because the more people understood the story behind that stain and the case in general, the harder it would be for the powerful to manipulate the official version. So we began participating in forums, talks, and gatherings in neighborhoods. We brought the truth to those who, until then, had only known rumors and fear. It was there that I could confirm that justice is not only done in courts, but also in the collective will and the rebuilding of trust. It was a slow process, as I told you, but every small advance felt like a little victory. The community began to break the silence, to support those who had made the effort to speak. In-house visits, in corner conversations, I heard testimonies not only of fear, but also of hope. Ordinary people beginning to understand that coming out of collective darkness was possible. And although fear remained present, there was a desire for change, a renewed energy that could be felt in the air. But the wounds were also evident, those deep cracks that corruption and fear had left in family and social trust. The family, with its contradictions, its resistance, and its courage, reflected that internal struggle that can accompany a tragedy that escapes the legal and touches the personal. That final meeting with them was a clear reminder that truth does not only question facts, but rearranges memories, emotions, bonds. In that sense, justice is also a process of healing, but a path that can be painful and full of resentment. After leaving that encounter, looking again at the night sky full of stars, I was overwhelmed by a very human feeling. The understanding that the fight continued, that I could not allow myself to lose hope or resign myself to the weight of the darkness we had uncovered. The stain on that shirt, that piece of evidence that seemed almost insignificant, was, in reality, a beacon lighting the way for those who do not want to close their eyes to injustice. An eternal reminder that, with patience and a keen eye, every detail can tell a story that transforms lives. I know this case still has many pages to write, and that justice may take time, may fracture, may be attacked from multiple fronts. But I also know that this is not only about an official verdict, but about a collective memory nourished by every testimony, by every little truth revealed. And in that sense, this story does not end today, nor tomorrow, nor any time soon. It is a constant call not to lower our guard, to keep the search alive, to listen to those signals others want buried. I will be there, watching, observing, telling every page, every stain, because in them lies the voice of a man who never wanted to be silenced. And as long as that voice keeps resonating, there will be no surrender,